Look at their boots. Then look at their suits. In the high-stakes theater of global politics, clothes aren't just fabric. They are a confession. It is April 2026. In the gilded halls of the Élysée Palace in Paris, the air is thick with the scent of expensive cologne and the quiet desperation of a dying empire. Emmanuel Macron, the self-appointed architect of Africa's future, is hosting his One Health Summit. He stands surrounded by African leaders who have traveled thousands of miles burning taxpayer money just to be seen in his presence. They look impeccable in their bespoke suits, their silk ties, and their polished shoes. But thousands of miles away, in the red, dusty heart of the Sahel, there is a different kind of leader. Captain Ibrahim Traoré isn't wearing silk. He isn't walking on marble. He is standing in the mud of a Burkina Faso farm, his camouflage uniform stained with the soil of his ancestors, his combat boots caked in the very earth that he has vowed to protect. While the suits in Paris are debating global health policies and signed off digital surveillance under the guise of pandemic prevention, the boots in Burkina Faso are supervising the harvest. One group is talking about survival. The other group is actually surviving. Why is this image the most dangerous thing the West has ever seen? Because for 60 years, the script was simple. Africa begs, and the West pretends to give. But in 2026, Ibrahim Traoré tore up that script and threw it into the fire. He proved that you don't need a seat at Macron's table if you own the kitchen, the seeds, and the fire. Today, we are diving into the most humiliating moment in French diplomatic history. We will uncover why the president of Ghana, a man Macron thought was his loyal ally, walked into the heart of Paris and delivered a psychological blow that left the French establishment in a state of shock. We will reveal the dark secrets behind the One Health agenda, a plan that Muammar Gaddafi warned us about decades ago. And most importantly, we will show you the tomato revolution. How a landlocked, sanctioned nation like Burkina Faso managed to bring the mighty economy of Ghana to its knees simply by refusing to sell them vegetables. This isn't just a news report. This is a post-mortem of neo-colonialism. This is the story of how the mud of the Sahel officially conquered the suits of Paris. Who really won the year 2026? The leaders who went to Washington and came back with empty pockets and shiny photos, or the leader who stayed in the trenches and came back with a full harvest? Buckle up, the mask is about to be ripped off. And by the end of this video, you will understand why the West isn't afraid of Africa's failure. They are terrified of Africa's success. The year 2026 has brought a new kind of warfare to the African continent. It doesn't involve tanks or fighter jets, but microscopes, digital health passes, and agricultural patents. At the center of this web is Emmanuel Macron's One Health initiative. On the surface, it's a global dream connecting the health of people, animals, and the environment. But for the nations of the Sahel, it feels more like a global nightmare. Why is the West suddenly so obsessed with African bats, African soil, and African livestock? The answer was hidden in plain sight decades ago. Muammar Gaddafi, the fallen lion of Libya, once stood before the world and dropped a truth bomb that many dismissed as a conspiracy. He said, they will create the virus themselves, and they will create the antidote. Then they will pretend to take time to find the solution when they already have it. In 2026, we are seeing this prophecy play out in real time. The One Health agenda is the perfect Trojan horse. Under the guise of preventing the next Ebola or the next disease X, Western powers are demanding total access to Africa's biological data. They want to map every virus in the Sahel, every genetic trait of African cattle, and every unique property of African crops. But ask yourself this: who owns the patents? Who owns the laboratories that will save us? And it's not the scientists in Ouagadougou or Bamako. It's the multi-billion-dollar pharmaceutical giants in Paris, Basel, and New York. This is biocolonialism. If they control your health data and your food safety standards, they control your life. They can shut down your exports with a single health alert. They can force your farmers to cull their herds based on risk assessments made in a glass office in Europe. Emmanuel Macron's smile at the summit isn't the smile of a doctor, it's the smile of a gatekeeper. He wants to be the one who decides when Africa is healthy enough to trade. He wants to use AI and digital surveillance to track every movement of an African cow, while the French Treasury continues to track every movement of the CFA franc. But there is a reason why Ibrahim Traoré refused to send his experts to this trap. Traoré understands that health is sovereignty. If you cannot produce your own medicine, you are not free. If you cannot define your own sanitary standards, you are a colony. While the other leaders were nodding along to Macron's presentation on global biosecurity, Traoré was busy strengthening the local traditional medicine institutes in Burkina Faso. He was investing in indigenous grain varieties that don't need Western chemical fertilizers or Western safety approvals. The West claims they want to protect Africa from a pandemic. But the biggest pandemic in Africa for the last 100 years hasn't been a virus. It has been the parasite of neocolonialism. A parasite that drains the minerals, dictates the politics, and now wants to patent the very DNA of the land. The 2026 summit was designed to cement this control. It was meant to be the final signature on a contract that would make African agriculture a subsidiary of Western Big Pharma. But Macron made one fatal mistake. He invited leaders who have been listening to the streets. He invited people who have seen the empty promises of the past. The trap was set. The bait was international aid and health infrastructure. But as the microphones turned on, the narrative began to crumble. Because you cannot talk about One Health to a continent that you have spent decades making sick through economic exploitation and environmental degradation. The tension in the room was palpable. Macron expected a chorus of, "Thank you, Mr. President." But instead, he was met with a chilling silence from the Ghanaian delegation, a silence that was about to be broken by a speech that would go viral from Cape Town to Cairo. Why did Ghana, the so-called golden child of Western democracy in Africa, decide to bite the hand that supposedly feeds it? To understand the shock on Emmanuel Macron's face in April 2026, you have to understand the invisible pressure building up in the streets of Accra, Kumasi, and Tamale. For decades, Ghana played the game. They followed the IMF's rules. They welcomed French corporations, and they maintained the polished image of a stable pro-Western partner. But by 2026, the people of Ghana realized that you cannot eat stability. While their leaders were receiving awards in Paris and Washington, the Ghanaian city was melting away, and the cost of living was crushing the youth. Enter the Traoré effect. Across the border in Burkina Faso, a young man in a red beret was doing what the democratic leaders were afraid to do. And he was kicking out the exploiters, nationalizing resources, and actually producing food. The youth of Ghana were watching this on TikTok and Telegram. They saw a leader who didn't care about a photo op at the Élysée Palace, but cared about the price of a bag of grain in the local market. So when President John Mahama stood up at the summit in Paris, he wasn't just speaking for himself. He was speaking with a metaphorical gun to his head, the gun of public anger. He knew that if he returned to Accra with nothing but more French promises and health protocols, he might not have a country to lead for much longer. The rebellion began with a simple but devastating observation. Mahama looked at the French cabinet and reminded them of a stark, uncompromising fact. A thriving Africa is not a threat to the world, but it is a threat to the colonial status quo. Think about the weight of that statement. Why would Macron see African success as a threat? Because French wealth is built on a foundation of African struggle. The CFA franc only works as long as Africa is a raw material warehouse and a captive market for European finished goods. If Ghana starts processing its own gold, if Burkina Faso starts canning its own tomatoes, if Mali starts refining its own lithium, then the French economy doesn't just slow down, it collapses. Macron's One Health Summit was supposed to be a distraction. It was supposed to be a way to keep African leaders busy talking about environmental protection while France continued to extract minerals for its green transition. But Mahama flipped the script. He brought the conversation back to the only thing that matters: dignity and sovereignty. He echoed the spirit of Ibrahim Traoré by suggesting that Africa can no longer survive at the mercy of donations and good gestures. He was telling Macron, right in his own house, that the age of the African beggar is officially dead. The silence in the room was deafening. You could hear the clicking of the cameras, but you could also hear the shifting of the tectonic plates of global power. Macron expected a co-chair who would help him sell his agenda to the rest of the continent. Instead, he found a Trojan horse who had smuggled the revolutionary fire of the Sahel right into the heart of Paris. This was the moment the West realized they were losing their grip. And it's one thing when a revolutionary like Traore or Assimi Goïta defies you. You can call them putschists or dictators. But when a democratically elected leader of a major economy like Ghana starts using the same language, you know the empire is in its final days. The Paris Rebellion of 2026 proved that the Sahelian spirit is contagious. It proved that you don't need to be a military man to realize that the West's help is actually a golden cage. And as the summit moved into its second day, the French diplomats weren't worried about One Health anymore. They were worried about how to stop a total African exodus from their sphere of influence. But the real drama wasn't just in the speeches. It was in the bank accounts and the dinner tables. While the world's cameras were fixed on the glittering chandeliers of Washington and Paris, a quiet but thunderous revolution was taking place in the rural heartlands of Burkina Faso. This wasn't a revolution of slogans. It was a revolution of tractors, irrigation canals, and sweat. This was Operation Food Sovereignty, the master plan of Captain Ibrahim Traoré that, by 2026, would rewrite the economic laws of West Africa. To understand the genius of Traoré, you have to look at what he did while other leaders were busy collecting frequent flyer miles. He didn't just tell people to farm, he mobilized the entire state apparatus. He took the defense budget and diverted a significant portion into agricultural machinery. He realized that a soldier who cannot feed his people is just a man with a gun, but a nation that can feed itself is an impregnable fortress. In 2025, Traoré launched the National Offensive for Agricultural Production. He didn't do it from an office in Ouagadougou. He went to the fields. He wore his combat boots and stepped into the mud alongside the women and the youth. He was there to see the first seeds of the high-yield, drought-resistant crops hit the soil, seeds that were developed in Burkina Faso labs, not imported from Western GMO giants. The results in 2026 are nothing short of a miracle. While the global north was struggling with supply chain disruptions and soaring fertilizer prices, Burkina Faso was celebrating a record-breaking harvest. But Traoré didn't stop at the harvest. He knew the colonial trap. Africa exports the raw tomato for pennies and buys back the canned paste for dollars. To break this cycle, he commissioned the construction of massive agro-processing hubs. By early 2026, Burkina Faso wasn't just growing tomatoes. They were processing them into paste, juice, and dried products. They weren't just growing cotton, they were spinning the thread. This is what the West calls industrialization. But when Traoré does it, they call it protectionism. The sheer scale of this achievement is what humiliated the leaders who went to the United States. Think about the irony. The president of Ghana and other African dignitaries sat in Washington, listening to lectures about sustainable development and food security. They took pictures with Joe Biden, smiling as if they had achieved something great. But when they returned home, their markets were empty. Their inflation was out of control. Why? Because they spent their time seeking investment from people who profit from Africa's dependence. They forgot that the most important investment isn't a loan from the World Bank. It's the water in your own wells and the seeds in your own hands. In 2026, the contrast became a painful reality for the average citizen. While a Ghanaian mother was counting her last coins to buy a single imported tomato, a Burkina Faso mother was seeing a surplus in her local market. Traore's boots in the mud strategy had produced more tangible results in 12 months than 60 years of Western capacity building programs ever did. This is the ultimate humiliation for the neo-colonial model. Traore proved that development isn't something that is granted to you by a former master at a summit. It is something you take from the earth through hard work and sovereign policy. He showed that a nation under sanctions, a nation labeled unstable by the West, could become the breadbasket of the region simply by looking inward. As the news of Burkina Faso's agricultural success spread, it created a crisis of legitimacy for every other leader in the region. How could a military putschist solve the hunger problem when the democratic darlings of the West could not? The answer was simple. Traore served the soil, while the others served the summit. 1 year in the mud. That was all it took to prove that the West's aid was never meant to make Africa self-sufficient. It was meant to keep Africa on a life support machine, forever grateful for the next donation. But Traore just unplugged the machine. And for the first time in history, the patient stood up, walked to the field, and started planting. While the West was busy labeling the Sahel as a zone of instability, and something historic was hardening in the heat of the desert. The Alliance of Sahel States, or the AES, was no longer just a mutual defense pact. By 2026, it had evolved into a Sahel fortress, a coordinated economic and political engine that was systematically dismantling every pillar of French influence in West Africa. The secret to their strength? Unity born of necessity. For decades, France followed the classic colonial rule: divide and conquer. They kept Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger isolated. But Ibrahim Traoré, Assimi Goïta, and Abdourahmane Tiani realized that if they stood alone, they would be picked off one by one. If they stood together, they became the masters of the world's most strategic resources: gold, uranium, lithium, and now food. In 2026, the most lethal weapon in the AES arsenal isn't a drone or a tank. It is the move toward a new sovereign currency. The CFA franc, a colonial relic, is in its death throes. The Sahel leaders have realized that you cannot claim to be independent if your wallet is kept in Paris. While the leaders in the Paris summit were talking about financial inclusion, the AES was busy building a common central bank and a gold-backed settlement system. This is why Macron is truly terrified. If the Sahel exits the CFA franc, the French treasury loses billions in liquidity. The colonial dollar collapses, and with it, the ability of France to fund its lifestyle on the backs of African peasants. The unity goes deeper than money. It is a unity of intelligence and infrastructure. In 2026, we see the first AES sovereignty corridors, joint agricultural projects where Malian cattle graze on Burkina Faso fodder, and Niger's energy powers the factories in Ouagadougou. They are building a self-contained ecosystem that doesn't need a single euro or a single advisor from the European Union. The Paris Summit of 2026 was a desperate attempt to break this fortress. Macron tried to offer security partnerships to individual members, hoping to tempt one to betray the others. But the response he got was a unified silence. The Sahel has learned its lesson. In 2026, the three musketeers of the Sahel operate as one fist. Traoré isn't just defending Burkina Faso anymore. He is the vanguard of a new African geopolitics. He has shown that when you stop asking for permission to exist, the world is forced to negotiate with you on your terms. The poor Sahel is now the only region in Africa that can look Macron in the eye and say no without blinking. Just because when you own your gold, your grain, and your guns, you don't need to fear the man in the suit. By mid-2026, the diplomatic games in Paris were eclipsed by a brutal reality on the ground. The One Health Summit was still busy discussing theoretical pandemics. But in the markets of West Africa, a real crisis had arrived: the Red Gold War. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, having secured Burkina Faso's domestic supply, decided it was time to show the region what true economic leverage looks like. For decades, countries like Ghana had looked at Burkina Faso as a mere supplier of cheap raw materials. But Traoré changed the equation. He issued a strategic ban on the export of raw tomatoes and onions. His message was simple: if you want our food, you buy our processed products. We are no longer your garden. We are an industrial power. But the impact in Ghana was catastrophic. Within weeks, the price of a single tomato in Accra exploded. We aren't talking about a small inflation. We are talking about a market meltdown. Mothers stood in front of vegetable stalls in tears, holding currency that was losing value by the hour, looking at empty crates that used to be filled with Burkina Faso produce. This is the ultimate humiliation for the Western-backed economic model. Ghana, the star pupil of the IMF, found itself paralyzed because a sanctioned neighbor decided to stop selling them vegetables. It exposed the hollow core of Ghana's economy. They had plenty of shiny bank buildings and strategic partnerships, but they couldn't even make a basic soup without the permission of Ibrahim Traoré. The irony was thick enough to choke on. While President Mahama was in Paris talking about how Africa's success is not a threat, his own citizens were realizing that their survival was entirely dependent on a man the West calls a military dictator. This wasn't just about tomatoes. It was about the collapse of the neo-colonial supply chain. Traoré broke the chain. By building processing plants in Ouagadougou and banning raw exports, he forced the value to stay in the Sahel. Macron watched this from the Élysée Palace with growing horror. The Tomato War of 2026 proved that France's traditional allies in Africa were weak, fragile, and utterly dependent. It showed that the AES now held the food trigger. If they could do this with tomatoes, imagine what happens when they do it with uranium or gold. The market meltdown was a masterclass in sovereign power. Traoré didn't need to fire a single shot to humiliate the pro-Western establishment. He just stayed in the mud, grew the food, and then closed the door. In 2026, the world learned that a leader who works the soil has more power than a leader who works the room at an international summit. As the Ghanaian government scrambled to send delegations to Ouagadougou to beg for a lifting of the ban, the power dynamic of West Africa officially shifted. The beggar had become the provider. The putschist had become the patron. And in the gilded halls of Paris, the champagne began to taste like ash because Macron realized that his One Health agenda meant nothing to a continent that was finally learning how to use its stomach as a shield. As the dust settles on the April 2026 Paris summit, the world is left with a picture that can never be unseen. On one side, we have the fading light of an empire, Emmanuel Macron and the Western establishment, clinging to their One Health protocols and their debt-trap diplomacy. On the other side, we have the blazing sunrise of a new Africa, embodied by the muddy boots of Ibrahim Traoré and the defiant words of those who have finally stopped asking for permission to be great. What we have witnessed in 2026 is not just a diplomatic disagreement, it is a civilizational shift. For a century, the West thought they were the brain and Africa was just the muscle. They thought they would provide the ideas, the technology, and the finance, while Africa provided the raw labor and the blood. But Traoré has flipped the skull. He has shown that the most advanced technology in the world is the political will to feed your own people. And the most valuable finance is the gold in your own mountains. And the most powerful idea is the simple, radical belief that Africa belongs to Africans. The Tomato War was just a warning shot. The Paris Rebellion was just the opening act. The real story of 2026 is the death of the African victim. For too long, the world was taught to look at Africa through the lens of pity. But today, the West looks at the Sahel and they don't feel pity. They feel fear. They fear the AES because it is a mirror reflecting their own parasitic nature. They fear Ibrahim Traoré because he is a leader they cannot buy, a soldier they cannot intimidate, and a farmer they cannot starve. To the youth of Ghana, Nigeria, Senegal, and Kenya, look at what happened in Paris. Look at how the mighty Macron trembled when the truth was spoken to his face. The power of the West is a hologram. It only exists as long as you believe in it. When you stop using their currency, when you stop buying their canned food, and when you start believing in the power of your own soil, the hologram vanishes. Ibrahim Traoré has given the continent a blueprint. It's a blueprint written in the mud of the trenches and the grease of the factories. It says, don't wait for the summit. Don't wait for the loan. Don't wait for the approval of a man in a suit who has never known the hunger of your people. Start where you are. Use what you have. Build your own fortress. The year 2026 marks the official end of the post-colonial era. We are entering the era of global African sovereignty, a time when the Sahel is no longer a buffer zone but a power center, a time when the captain of the poor has shown that the true wealth of a nation is not measured by its GDP in Washington, but by the dignity of its citizens and the fullness of its granaries. Emmanuel Macron can keep his champagne and his gilded halls. We will keep our red soil and our iron will. The world is changing, and for the first time in 500 years, Africa is the one holding the pen. The story being written today isn't a story of aid or development. It is a story of conquest. The conquest of our own minds, our own resources, and our own future. The lion has not only woken up, the lion has started to hunt. And the hunters of yesterday are now realizing that the fence they built to keep us in has now become the cage that keeps them out. The sun is rising over the Sahel, and its light is blinding the empires of old. If you are proud to witness this turning point in history, if you stand with the spirit of Thomas Sankara, Muammar Gaddafi, and Ibrahim Traoré, if you believe that the future of the world is being written in the mud of an African farm and not the marble of a French palace, type Africa Rise or Amen in the comments right now. Let your voice be part of the thunder that is shaking the foundations of the Élysée Palace. Subscribe and share this message because the revolution will not be televised. It will be grown in the soil and defended by the brave. Africa is no longer the continent of the future. Africa is the power of the now. Africa, rise. Amen.